in March. And that was really an opportunity for anyone to give an overview of their program and the research that they've been conducting. And so as a follow-on, we've organized this meeting with a theme of observing. And so we're hoping to get a report from each of our speakers who have done research thus far in 2018 on just what exactly they've been seeing going on in the region. So we should be getting some pretty fresh, new, and exciting updates for what kind of observations have been made so far this year. And so leading into just a heads up for what our theme of our next meeting will be, we're going to focus on modeling, and that will be sometime in early 2019, but we're going to try to rotate the focus of each of these meetings. And of course, if any of you as participants have suggestions for meeting focus areas, please email me. I'm very open to taking direction on what would be most useful for all of you calling in and participating in these calls. So today we have 10 speakers lined up that are going to be giving roughly 5-minute updates on their work. So these speakers range from NOAA laboratories or NOAA-funded PIs that are in academic institutions or through cooperative institutes. So without further ado, we will get started going through those updates. So we're going to start with Taneil at ESRL. And so I have all the slides. I'm getting a little bit of background. If everyone could just make sure again that you're muted, that would be really great. Okay.
And Emily, this is Sandy. I just wanted to let people know we're recording the call now.
Yes. And also we will be, with the permission of all the speakers, which I haven't heard any nays yet, sharing the slides that are compiled into a single deck. So I have all the slides. I'm going to be running through them on behalf of each of the speakers just to help with the logistics of the call running a little bit smoother. So just remember to let me know when you're ready to advance to the next slide. And so after we go through our observing updates, we're going to have Bill Manley with the Arctic Observing viewer give a guest talk about the data visualization tool that he works with and opportunities to upload your data into this visualization tool. So with that, we will get started. Looks like we've got most everybody on the line, so let me change. So Taneil, are you ready to go? Taneil, you might be on mute.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
You're unmuted. Okay. So I've got your first slide up. Just let me know when you want me to go to the next slide.
Okay, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I just have 5 minutes, so I just sort of organized the slides I had into our 2018 campaigns, our 2018 continuous measurements, and then our 2018 for other observing plans that we're going to have. So I won't have time to discuss any of these in particular, so I'm just basically going to read through the list, and I'm hoping for this slide deck, and especially since I'm recording this presentation, the fact that I think I have a link for every single one of these that will sort of provide the basis for information for what we're doing at PSD ESRL. I'm going to say in advance that a lot of the work we're doing is through our cooperative institutes, scientists, and they are principal investigators on ONR and NSF and DOE activities, and so that is one reason that we have such a full, juicy list of things here to present. So for the 2018 campaigns, we have something called DICE, and that was an ARP-funded project that we have tackled the problem of how to do broadband radiometric measurements in the Arctic. There is the Popeye program, profiling at a look-took point to enhance the Europolar prediction. There is the SODA project, which is actually going on now. That's stratified ocean dynamics of the Arctic. There's AVPOP, which was aerosol vertical profiling at a look-took point, which was led by Jesse Creeman. Dr. Creeman also was the lead, I believe, on INARCO, which was ice nucleation over the Arctic Ocean, and that was a heli cruise. Next slide, please. Okay, in terms of our continuous measurements that were before 2018 and still going on, we sort of have an umbrella project I think you're all aware of is ISO, the International Arctic Systems Observing the Atmosphere, where we essentially have composed a network of observations throughout the Pan-Arctic region that NOAA is sort of the leader and leveraging body for that, but allows us to take advantage of measurements being taken by the other Arctic countries at their major observatories. The place where we, in particular through the ARP, have direct observing assets are TIXI Russia, Alert Canada, and Eureka Canada. And those have been long-term, more than a decade, ongoing measurement. I think we have something like 28 data streams coming in from TIXI Russia. Alert is mostly radiation measurements. And in Eureka Canada, we really partnered with Environment Canada and the university consortium in Canada called CANDAC to build up an observatory that has like DOE-like capacity. And Matt Shoup is the lead on a program called Ice Caps, the integrated characteristics for energy, clouds, atmosphere, state, and precipitation at Summit, which is at the Summit Greenland Station. Next slide, please. And so for my next slide, I'm kind of talking about what the ESRL Physical Sciences Division, what our Arctic observation stations are looking, what kind of planning we've been doing in 2018, because that is actually a very major thing. First of all, there's MOSAIC. I think many of you know about it, and many of you are going to be involved with it. The Multidisciplinary Drifting Observatory for Study of Arctic Climate. And I am on the steering committee for an entity called T-MOSAIC, which is just kind of gearing up right now. And even though it has MOSAIC, you have to be careful. That acronym stands for something else. It's the Terrestrial Multidisciplinary Distributed Observatories for the Study of the Arctic. And I have a little schematic there in the upper right-hand corner showing how MOSAIC and T-MOSAIC as an integrated observing asset is planned to work. TIXI, Alert, Eureka, we're working on transitions to the host agencies, and we are doing a lot of work with orienting our observations to support YOP, the Year of Polar Prediction, and then also through DOE, Stabeno is working on the Icarus project, which is the inaugural campaigns for armed research using unmanned systems. And actually there's several DOE, NOAA related unmanned aircraft things going on up in Alaska. And my final slide is just a picture. Next, yep. And so just basically we have a nice poster here, and we've got stations all over the place that we kind of have our fingers on and that we are collaborating with. We have this major Arctic ice camp project coming along, and then I kind of photoshopped in, there's these little squares there, you see little planes flying around, we've got a lot of balloon deployments, so that's kind of our net observing activities that we've got going on at PSD ESRL. And I'm done.
Thank you, Taneil. I think that this slide deck is incredibly large because we have a lot of photos and videos, so it's being pretty slow advancing, so be patient with me. So our next speaker is from ESRL, the Global Monitoring Division, Brian Vasel. Brian, are you ready to go?
Yes, ma'am. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. So I have two slides. I'm just going to do a quick update on our activities in Barrow, Alaska, and Summit, Greenland, and then turn over to Colm Sweeney, who's also on the line, that can do a quick update on his aircraft missions in Alaska. So unfortunately, my computer is not cooperating, so I'm not seeing the slides at the moment. Do we have the Barrow Observatory slide up?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So I'm pleased to announce to everyone that as of about 7:15 last evening, we awarded a contract, a design build for a new facility in Barrow. We've been working hard for about close to 20 years to make this happen. So this is a big milestone for GMD, for our observatory there, but I think of it in a much broader sense of U.S. Arctic science. We're increasing our facility from 900 square feet to 2,400. We're working to get fiber to the site. I do see this as a place we can collaborate and support our other lines within NOAA and the Arctic mission that we have as an agency to support a lot more science. We've essentially turned away all science since 2007, except for the de-ice campaign that Taneil mentioned. And the only reason we could actually support that in Barrow is because it was on their roof. And we had a fairly open roof space inside the building was just chock full. So I'm really excited that we're going to have this opportunity to collaborate and support a lot more science. And this is, step one is starting to tell our NOAA colleagues that we have this opportunity and we can support science, but then it's going to be moving external to the agency and see what other science can we support for our university and other federal entities. So it's a pretty large change in our infrastructure up there. We'll have a 30-meter tower. We already support NESDIS for satellite downlinks. We don't see that changing. They might actually add another antenna to the site, but we do have 2 technicians there to support science year-round. So not quite a new update for 2018 on the science side, but a pretty rather large facility update for us. So switching to the next slide for Summit. I'm not completely up to speed on this, the community on the phone and what they know about our operations, but we did have a long-term commitment with the National Science Foundation to staff and NOAA employee at Summit Greenland. And due to some budget issues, we had to pull back on that agreement and say we're going to focus on some core science, but we're not going to have a NOAA science technician up there running instrumentation. So we're really doing the low impact type stuff like filling a flask, which is a bottle of air we can measure about 50+ species out of on a weekly basis, and not doing in situ measurements that take a lot more infrastructure to move back and forth and to run in real time. So we're still doing some flask measurements, but we're also contributing to flight operations with meteorology and assisting with the calibrations. That is a collaborative effort between the US and the Swiss to run a suite of solar radiation equipment at the site. So with that, I think I'll stop there and leave some time for Colm to talk about his aircraft work.
So Colm actually sent a message to the group and he wasn't able to join on audio. So if you have any updates that you were prepared to give on his behalf, that would be okay. And if not, we can move on.
I do not, but Diane is on the line. She might.
Yeah, I think we should move on and then we'll call him on the next round next spring.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you.
So next up we have Phyllis from PMEL. It looked like PMEL had a big group in a room.
Okay.
Gotcha.
So EcoFOCI is a cross-line office program of fisheries and OAR. So what's presented here is a combination of each. We had a number of cruises to the northern Bering Sea, and we participated on the Healy cruise, which Jackie is going to talk more about later. We collected about 550 nutrient samples and 55 zooplankton tows, 160 oxygen samples, and about 500 chlorophylls. But one of the big parts of that Healy cruise was the recovery and redeployment of moorings. We recovered about 25 moorings. Everything that we deployed the previous year as part of the NPRB's Arctic IERP program was recovered successfully. Looks like almost all the instruments worked. Shown here are the type of measurements at each of the sites. Catherine Burchak has an immense supply or array of passive acoustics listening for the whales and marine mammals. One of our primary line here is the Icy Cape line. It was first deployed in 2010 as part of FOAM's CHAOS program. So I'll talk just a little bit about some of the results. Next slide. Could you click some movie moves, maybe? So every year we deploy a half a dozen to maybe about 10 satellite track drifters. The flow class Icy Cape is about 40% of the flow through Bering Strait. And you can see the very strong flow that goes out Barrow Canyon and it turns left to follow the slope. In this last year, the currents in May and June were particularly weak. Next slide, please. And so from the icy cape moorings, we have a transport measurements, and this is the transport that goes by icy cape. You can see maximum in July, immense variability in the winter months. Next click, please. So last year, this is the transport measurements that we saw, or that we measured there. And you can see that, as I say, May and June were about half of the transport you usually see, but July and August were just right on the 9-year average. The interesting part is February. The Bering Sea had a minimum ice extent this year. It never got south of St. Matthew's Island. And one of the big events was in February and early March, was very strong winds out of the south that pushed the ice back. It also enhanced the flow on the shelf. So it was pushing relatively warm water through Bering Strait. And the previous year in November, that large transport of almost 2 was in 2017. The ice came down very late in the Arctic last year. And one of the reasons was large heat content, but also this strong northward transport that continued to push warm water in November. Next slide. So this is C1, which is the icy cape innermost mooring. And the only message to take from this is on the right, the black lines are temperature. And what you see in October and November, the water column is mixed. These are bottom temperatures. And you can see how warm 2017 was. And it stayed warm fairly late into the year, into December. And so that was one of the reasons of the slow or late arrival of ice in the region. Next slide. So this is fisheries. And this is some work of Chris Wilson and Alex D. Robertus. And this is the first time that they have deployed an acoustic sensor at C1 in the on our mooring, or next to one of our moorings there. And what this is at the beginning you can see the fish in the bottom. It's probably Arctic cod. The red at the top is bubbles, wind mixing and pushing the bubbles down. You see the arrival of ice and the disappearance of the Arctic cod. When the ice disappears, it kind of fades. You see not a strong return of the Arctic cod. We recovered 3 of these moorings from the southern to the northern shelf. 2 of them worked, 1 didn't, and we redeployed them all. And so hopefully next year we'll see what happens. Does the concentrations of fish increase in August and September of next year? So that was kind of the highlights of what we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. So next is also in the room at PMEL, Jessica Cross is going to give an update on her work. Ready, Jess?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Jessica Cross. I'm a carbon chemist, and the 2 projects that I have with the Arctic Research Program sort of expand NOAA's carbon portfolio up into the Arctic. And we do that 2 different ways. 1, by bringing autonomous vehicles up into the Arctic, and 2, by participating in the DBO NCIS cruise on board the Healy every year. So this is the second of a 3-year project. So I'm showing the map in 2017 on the left, and the map in 2018 on the right. Those gray tracks are our autonomous vehicle tracks. The yellow dots are the carbon stations that we occupied on the Healy, and the bold black lines are sort of our planned surveys. The key difference between 2017 and 2018 was clearly ice cover. I'm showing the ice cover as overlays on both of these maps from the MASM-2 publicly available product from the NSIDC on the date of our closest approach to the ice in each year. So you can tell that there was a lot more ice in 2018 than there was in 2017. This impacted our ability to get to some of our planned surveys, particularly DB05 and that zigzag survey along the shelf break. But the ice did eventually melt back in 2018 enough for us to access the PMEL over the top of Hannah Shoal. Next slide, please. Oh, right. So anyway, like I said, the ice was one of the key challenges that we faced this year. The way that we keep the autonomous vehicles safe, since they are autonomous, and we do try not to crash them every year, is by being very careful about our collaborations with the Naval Ice Center and the NSIDC to make sure that we know where the ice is. We do use a publicly available product, MASM-2, as well as the UMETSAT publicly available product for research purposes, but we also collaborate internally with the U.S. Naval Ice Center, and they send us a product every day with the contour lines for the 0% ice edge that has a very limited lag and an extraordinarily high resolution that enables us to navigate around these hazards. Next slide, please. So this is just a brief summary of what we saw during this particular year. Looks like that image on the right is not displaying very well, but we'll start on the left. I'm just showing here two panels, one for 2017 and one for 2018. They show the temperature salinity distribution with the dPCO2, or the difference in PCO2 between the atmosphere and the ocean, in color. In 2018, I want to just note that the water was a lot warmer and fresher. You can definitely see that by the distribution of Alaska coastal water, or ACW, there in the upper left-hand corner of that bottom panel. As well, we see a lot more cool colors, those cold colors in our ice melt region in 2018 relative to 2017. Because there was so much ice cover up in the Chukchi, we were accessing that region very, very close right after ice retreat had begun. And so we got the opportunity to see that bloom just as it was taking off, as phytoplankton draw carbon dioxide out of the surface water and create that cool colored deficit. I also wanted to share here some of the regional results. Again, from my screen, it doesn't look like they're displaying particularly well, but at DBO2, we can definitely see that there were some high PCO2 values in Anadir water. Those are those warm colors that you can see there just on the westernmost edge of the survey. Emily, if you click. And then as well in DBO, along DBO4, sort of this region that spans sort of the mid-Chukchi Shelf to the northern shelf in Hannah Shoal, we could see a lot more of that regional PCO2 drawdown indicating primary productivity. Again, those are those cool colors that you're looking at. This year, relative to last year, we also spent a lot more time at the near shore, and those whites and very weak warm colors that you can see at the near shore indicate equilibrated PCO2 values right there in those very shallow waters that overturn very well, and that turbulence causes an equilibration of ocean carbon with atmospheric carbon. Again, we didn't get to DBO5, the shelf break, or the basin this year, as there was a pretty persistent band of ice right in our way. Next slide, please. After we go out and we collect these measurements, one of the next key steps for us is calibration. We had multiple fronts of calibration this year. The Healy has an autonomous underway system on board that's run by Taro Takahashi that collects underway PCO2 measurements. As well, we use the Healy's underway seawater line that's plumbed directly onto the ship to take some discrete samples. Last year, we noticed some discrepancy between what the Saildrones were seeing, our autonomous vehicles were seeing, and what was recognized right on the Healy. And so we sent a small boat out to collect some direct calibration samples. We got really, really close to the drones this year, and once those samples are analyzed, we hope that that's going to assist us in this calibration effort. Next slide, please. Oh, I just wanted to say thanks to Jessie, who popped up in the yellow box right there. While I was directing operations on the bridge, she was actually the one who went out in the cold and collected all of those samples for me. So next slide. One of the other things that we did this year was we worked with the University of New Hampshire in a grant that they have through the Ocean Acidification program to deploy an underway alkalinity sensor, a prototype that they've been working on with Kongsberg Maritime and specifically the Contrast division there. Those systems are not designed to work very well in low salinity waters. And so this, as you can see in this picture, maybe that low salinity surface lens was something that we had to cope with this year. So very fortunately, again, we were able to take a small boat out to take some calibration samples. Emily, if you click, that's me and Jesse getting ready to go out in the small boat into the ice and collect some of these end member samples. Click one more time for me. And this is what we saw. The advantage of working with these autonomous systems, especially when they have onboard calibration, like the Contrast system does, is that we can get the data back almost immediately. So on the left, I'm just showing a surface plot of the alkalinity distribution there, and you can see sort of down at DBO3, you see those warm colors. Those are higher alkalinity concentrations, and then as well up in the ice melt, you see these very low alkalinity concentrations. And again, in order to calibrate the instrument at those low, in those low salinity areas, it's going to be extraordinarily important for us to verify that relative to those discrete samples. On the right-hand side, this is just another way of showing the temperature salinity distribution along with the alkalinity in color. And this helps us verify that we aren't seeing pretty significant lag, which was something that we had to cope with initially in our data processing. And so at the low salinity end, we see low alkalinity values. At the high salinity end, we see higher alkalinity values, exactly as we would expect. So for this experimental system, we actually think that it worked really well. Emily, I think there are 2 more slides in this deck, but these are just blown up versions of our survey in 2017, and if you click one more time, in 2018. I don't really have anything to add to those, but they're a lot easier to see when they're bigger than when they're really small.
Thank you, Jessica. Sorry that one slide was messed up. Okay, so moving on to our next speaker, we have Bruce Baker, who's going to be talking about the U.S. Climate Reference Network in Alaska. Bruce, are you ready?
I'm ready. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Okay,
great. So I thought we'd give you an update on our OAR-supported Alaska Climate Reference Network. It's now at the stage where there's sufficient data over a long enough period of time to start looking at trends, for example, both in temperature and precipitation. So next slide, please. So what are we trying to do here? We're really looking at having a long-term observing network in Alaska to help improve our understanding of the climate in those regions and how it's affecting the Arctic. Our goal is to have 29 of these stations established throughout Alaska by 2022. I think we've got 24 now installed. We plan on installing another 2 next year. So we're on track to have all 29, we hope, in the ground by 2022. Next slide. This is a distribution of where these stations are. The blue dots are where they're currently installed, and the yellow are surveyed sites, and most of those will probably get installations. Can you click on that map, maybe? Let's see if this works or not. It may or may not work.
It's popping up another web page. Do you want me to share the web page?
Yeah.
Okay. That's going to take me a minute.
So I just had this link to our homepage at Atmospheric Turbulence and Diffusion Division. And so this gives you an idea of distribution. If you click on one of the triangles within Alaska, it's just a way to see what the site looks like, and also current conditions. And if you see down at the very bottom on the right-hand side, you can actually then go and look at the entire period of record from the National Centers for Environmental Studies. So that's all I want to illustrate there, just to show you that we're sort of trying to make it more user-friendly so that you can actually see the sites, look at the time series, and also the current data at that point. Okay, next, go back to the next slide, please.
Oops.
So what are we finding? We're starting to actually have enough data, as I said, to look for trends. And so we are starting to look at it seasonally, and this happens to be the maximum air temperature. I think the most remarkable thing to examine is really in the southern portion, and also especially in the southern portion from left to right. In almost every case, we have warming, and the black circles around the red dots is at the 95% confidence interval. The interesting thing about this, when you start looking at these time series, and we haven't really delved into it totally yet, is that there's an inflection point in 2011. And it seems like in 2011, that's where there was almost a dramatic rise, or started to become a higher or larger trend in the increase in temperature, almost in all of the different temperature variables we have, which is the max, the min, the mean, and we also have the skin temperature. So that we found interesting. We haven't delved into it yet. We just started looking at this because we now think we have enough data from at least these stations to make some statements about the trends. Can we have the next slide, please? So that's max temperature. Next slide is mean temperature. Once again, you can see the southern tiers really dramatically increasing at 1.4, 1.5 degrees per decade. Next slide, please. Min temperature, once again, we see that the southern tiers predominantly increasing with that same trend and change per decade. And then next slide. This is the surface. This is the actual skin temperature. We measure the surface of the Earth with this little temperature sensor. And so this truly is the warming of the ground when you think about it, because we're actually measuring the ground temperature, so right at the surface. And I think what is dramatic is in almost in every case seasonally that we truly are seeing a dramatic increase in the temperature, especially in southern Alaska. The interior is not showing as much. And also when you look at, I didn't show this slide, we have one for precipitation too, but in all, precipitation seems to be, we're not detecting any trends at a 95% confidence level, so there's not a dramatic decrease or increase in precip, but it does say that with this dramatic increase, there's certainly going to be a lot more evaporative transfer going on with what we do have, so that could be causing more moisture into the air, but it also could mean that there's certainly places where there's going to be a lot less snow and a snowpack. So in terms of water supply, this could be maybe a significant issue for Alaska down the road as we move down in the future. That's it for me.
And I may need to unmute some. I had to manually mute some people from my side. So who's presenting on this one? You're muted, Emily.
John Woods.
John Woods, okay. John, could you type your phone number into the chat so I know which one to unmute?
Four 443-603.
Okay.
So John is probably the reason that our slides are slow, because he's got some really fun videos.
All right, I think I've got you unmuted now.
Thanks. Yep. Can you hear me, Sandy?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Thanks, John.
Great. Okay. Yep. Thanks. So this is in cooperation with Ignatius Rigger. We actually met last night up here in Anchorage, and we're able to put together some slides. Next slide, please. So this, again, working with the National Ice Center, where I'm actually there in my NOAA role. We were supporting him with some special sport products. You can see there on the left-hand image, this is that old ice that's kind of floating off the north slope in the Chukchi, and that's him flying over in a Coast Guard C-130 just 2 days ago, deploying one of these new GPS trackers that Pacific Gyre makes for the International Arctic Buoy program. So pretty neat. If you go to the next slide, you can actually, you don't need to play the video again. It's a little choppy. I can share all these videos too. You can see this thing is just this little kind of literally a ball, kind of looks a little bit more like a cone. It's got GPS in it, no parachute needed. It just goes out the back of the aircraft. And again, this is tagging that old ice that's kind of floating around in the Chukchi that's caused some issues this summer. So pretty interesting deployment there. Again, this was part of the Scissors project, the ONR Scissors, used to be the Arctic Domain Awareness flights in coordination with the U.S. Coast Guard. Next slide shows another deployment, hopefully, of an AXIB this time, which is the larger Met buoys. So this is the buoy that we get 2-meter temperatures with, as well as oceanographic data in real time. And you can see that one hopefully is playing nice and smooth for you as well. A good parachute deployment in open water. And again, this is all part of the Scissors flight that just occurred yesterday on the 150 West line, or I'm sorry, 2 days ago. So next slide. Oh, skip this again. There we go. So this was the deployment plan map from the spring that most folks are hopefully familiar with. You'll see all sorts of different cruises and aircraft flights and even ice camps on here. I think a better depiction are the next couple slides. We're focused on the RE deployment at the North Pole this year, so they did get some SVPs out from the Barneo camp. This was again in support of AON and YOP in collaboration with UMetNet and RE, as well as the US IABP. Next slide. This is the latest map, again, as of 2 days ago or yesterday even, kind of working around clockwise around the Arctic, starting off of Canada. We started out the spring with the Navy ice camp. We got some buoys out there. The Healy's up there for us now. Polar Stern and the NABOS cruises have gotten out there. We're actually expecting some of those holes that you see kind of in the Eastern Arctic to be filled in. There's an extra, maybe, I think you said 15 SVPs that are on board the Russian breakers right now that are hopefully going to be filling in some of those gaps. You can see the Odin deployments, and then moving around, we had some airborne deployments in the spring that really helped fill in the Canadian Arctic gaps, specifically their Met areas. Through this year was a Canadian Air Force C-130 that did those deployments for us. And then last is the U.S. Coast Guard C-130s, just as of yesterday. And then this final slide was just the kind of wrap up. You can see total of 55 plus buoys of all those things that I've mentioned, and you can kind of see the detailed breakdown there. So thanks again for your time.
Thank you for that update, John. Next up, we have Jackie Grebmeier and Lee Cooper, who are PIs with the Arctic Research Program, who are going to be giving an update on the Healy 1801 cruise. Jackie and Lee, are you ready?
Yes, if you can hear me. This, thank you very much. So this is an update on the cruise in relation, you can go to the next slide, Emily, on the DBO program, which I think many of you already know about this, but on the Healy 1301, we were able to do, 1801, excuse me, the CGDs, the chlorophyll nutrients, all the listing of the shift-based operations there. And then, as both Phyllis and Jessica have mentioned, with the moorings and the Saildrone observations, and we have collaborative projects through NASA and our NSF funding for satellite observations, specifically on the DBO. And so, the next slide, I'll just highlight a few of the measurements that we did on the 218. As Phyllis said, it was a combination of the EcoFOCI program, the DBO, and the Northern Chukchi Integrated Study. And what you're seeing on the right-hand side there are the is the cruise map that we originally start with, and it was actually expanded a little bit to do some surveys up by even more on the Barrow outflow, and I would let Bob Picard cover that if he was on here. But our standard measurements, as you can see on the left-hand side there, we were able to occupy 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then a focused primarily physical oceanography survey on that outflow. We did do the measurements, as you see on the left. In our component, we're looking at the chlorophyll A in the sediments, a lot of focus on the benthic populations. Lee will talk about some of the O18 and why that is being done. We also had some respiration experiments into this cruise. Next slide. This is a listing of our component here, and the oxygen 18 work, Lee can mention a little bit more on that, but we're looking at using that as to look at the percentage of melted ice in surface waters, as well as a water mass tracer. We did you can see the numbers in bold there, the number of stations we did for chlorophyll, which is an indicator of carbon export to the surface sediments. We brought back all these samples for looking at carbon and nitrogen, both using stable isotope instrumentation. We also are measuring grain size, Ostrakod taxonomy to look at some paleoceanographic aspects, as well as the IP25. And then finally, I would say that the stations for these metabolism work is with our graduate student looking at carbon export and nutrient flux. And she also ran individual clam studies to look at the components and the drivers of that, the changes that we're seeing up in that region. And then the macrofaunal grabs that we've done at 48 of the stations on the DBO lines, and as well as on the Icy Cape and the Ledyard Bay lines. So Lee, do you want to say a few things on the rest of it?
Yeah, sure. We did do some collections for oxygen isotopes in addition to the water mass and melted sea ice proportions that we can come up with. We're also looking at, we've noticed with our 30-year record of collections made at a salinity of 33.1, which is the upper ocean halocline, that the O18 numbers are drifting more negative, which is consistent with more fresh water flowing through Bering Strait, which of course isn't news, but it also possibly gives us an independent way to estimate the Pacific inflow. We did one deep station for sediment cores that are going to be looked at for flora, fauna, biomarkers. We're going to do sedimentation analysis too. We had 3 PhD students from the University of Maryland participate on our team. And we also collected the surface sediments that we provided to the harmful algal bloom study that you'll hear about in a few minutes. Why don't we go on to the next slide? And then this shows the stations that where we made occupations, so that we can go on to the next slide. I'll show you a brief result. We did do this work on board where we collect surface sediments and determine the active chlorophyll A that's in those surface sediments, and this varies quite a bit week to week. It depends on how much recent deposition there had been. We did. These numbers are a little lower than what we saw in the prior year in 2017 on the same, some of the same stations. And we also occupied a lot of these same stations in July on the Canadian Sir Wilfrid Laurier. And those numbers were much higher because we were there earlier in the season. So this looks like it's continuing to be a useful indicator of where there's a lot of particle deposition. I think that's the last slide, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay, so next up we have Don Anderson, who's going to be giving an update on the harmful algal bloom research. And just a quick pause, I just realized that we skipped over, this is my fault, Don Perovich. Don, I did not forget you. I forgot to put your slides in the compiled deck, but we'll go through your slides as soon as we're done with these updates. So Don Anderson, if you are ready. And
yes, I am.
Okay, there you are. There you go.
Okay. So this is our first time on one of these calls. I also am going to use a number of these slides next week when we're actually having a HAB-focused call. So we're going to skip a number of the ones that are here. But yes, let's go to the next slide. Just to give you a quick background of why we're doing this, there's been a great deal of interest lately in harmful algal blooms. You can see in the upper right, Kathy Lefebvre from the Pacific, the Northwest Science Center there, analyzed many different marine mammals and found 2 major algal toxins in many of them, and some at very high levels. There have also been a number of recent mortalities of walruses and seabirds, and there's a great deal of interest but very little knowledge. So part of what we're doing is try to get some baseline information. The next one, please. And just so you know, one of the organisms is called Alexandrium catenella. You see it in the sort of the purple image there, but it's important to note it also has this dormant stage, a cyst stage, that is in the sediments much of the year. This one makes a family of toxins called saxitoxins, and in the map up there, you can see that there's a whole suite of these toxins, and they actually are very useful as a fingerprint. And one of the things we're trying to do through time is to look at the distribution of these toxins or these toxin types in different strains because that'll tell us a lot about the pathways with which these organisms are potentially moving into the Arctic. If you notice, the very top circle is sort of pink, and if you look at the other analyses around the region, the closest relatives are actually over on the Russian coast, not so much down in the Aleutians or the Bering Sea. So we want to build a much bigger map to understand these transport pathways. Okay, the next one, please. Now, another important observation from years ago, you can see in that map, this huge black circle shows something that our Japanese colleagues found, which was a huge abundance of these Alexandrium cysts in the Chukchi, essentially higher or as high as we see anywhere else in the world. And so one of the questions is really how new that is, how long they've been there, and what are the impacts on the local ecosystems, including on the subsistence food sources. So the next slide. There's another toxic organism we're looking at as well called Pseudonychia. Causes a problem that actually in humans can cause brain damage, permanent brain damage, and kills a lot of animals, seabirds, sea lions, and so forth. There are 8 different species of Pseudonychia so far reported in the Arctic. Several are toxic, but virtually nothing is known about their distribution. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to be participating in, well, we did 1801, also 1803. I won't go through the details other than to mention that we're really trying to build up baseline information about these 2 particular HAB groups, the Alexandrium and the Pseudonychia. Next one, please. This you don't need to see again. You've already seen the map several times for Healy 1801. And you can see we'll be on 1803 as well. Next one tells us about how what we are trying to do, and it's basically water collections where we're looking for cells in the water column, sediment collection to look at these cysts of Alexandrium in the sediments as sort of an indication of where potential seed beds or the inoculum for these blooms might be occurring. The next one shows an instrument that we deployed that is, I think, very interesting, very powerful, called the Imaging Flow Cytobot, or IFCB. You can see it on the right where it was tied down on the ship, receiving continuous flow of water. And in the middle is a dashboard showing many of the rather high-resolution images we can get, 8 to 10 per second. And these brown dark balls are Alexandrium cells, and you could see there's some diatoms in the upper right as well, and we can use these on a real-time basis to try to see what's going on. The next slide, please. So in terms of the sediments, these circles on the right, the colors show you the density of cysts of Alexandrium we found in the various samples that Jackie and others were so helpful in getting for us. You can see basically as you start in known, the numbers, we found them everywhere. We found these cysts in every sample, but they're quite low as you go into the Bering Strait. And then as you get to DB03, they're much closer to shore. And in the Ledyard Bay, you can see our highest concentration, again, very similar to the Japanese observations of around 10,000 cysts per cubic centimeter. And as you head towards the Beaufort Sea, you can see they dropped and got lower and lower. And right near that DB05, the numbers are actually high again, but not quite as high as they were at our highest station. The next one shows you the flow site, the imaging flow cytobot data. We're still working up a lot of it. We also collected water samples that we will use a regular microscope, fluorescence microscope method called FISH to count cells. But what we saw was basically in the low concentrations of cells in the water near Nome and in the Bering Strait, increasing at these offshore stations of DB03 to around 1,000 cells per liter. And I should say that in the Gulf of Maine, for example, 1,000 cells per liter is more than enough to cause dangerous toxicity in shellfish. The highest observations we had was, again, in that, you can see the red circle up there, around 5,000 cells per liter, and other stations perhaps a couple thousand. And then as you go further to the east, the cell number dropped off dramatically, and we're very, very low. So you see an interesting grade, I won't even call it a gradient, but going from low to high to low again along the cruise transect. It's going to be very interesting to try to explain. Next one, please. Pseudonychia, we basically have only some preliminary IFCB data. We did see Pseudonychia species in those dashboards, but they're not quantified yet. And then one of the things that's will be done with these samples, you can see on the next slide, which is an example from the Gulf of Maine. It's a method called ERISA, where you get a pie chart, basically. There's something missing. Try hitting it again, see if, no, all right, go back. But if these different circles on the right, the pie charts are from different places along the coast, and the colors represent different species of Pseudonychia, with the most toxic being this red one, Pseudonychia australis. And you could see how it's very prevalent up in the eastern part of the Gulf of Maine and gone from the western part. And that's what we're wondering what we will see with the samples we've taken on the Healy. So that's it. I think my next slide is more about what we're going to do. It's perhaps of interest to this group. We've gotten funded not only for 1803, but next year for an NSF-funded cruise that you can see in that map on the right, that will be focused, Bob Picard's the co-PI with me, and will be focused on this Alaskan coastal current and especially on Alexandrium, again, cysts and nodal cells, as well as Pseudonychia, and that'll be sometime next summer. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, John. And the last update is coming from CIFAR. So Uma, do we have you on the line?
You do. I show up as David Newman.
Yes, you do. And that's your husband's name, right? Is this? Okay, yeah, I remember this. Okay, thanks, Uma. Ready?
Thanks, Emily. So I'm going to provide some highlights of field work and associated work done in at the University of Alaska, or in Alaska, that's been funded through NOAA by CIFAR. The first highlight is the NABOS program, which it is run by Igor Polyakov, who's the PI of the project, and most of that's funded by NSF, but Till Bowman, who's shown in this photo here, is a twice-funded CIFAR student, and the NABOS cruise is just finishing up right now, and what's great about it is there's data starting from 2002, and there's a photo here of the ship, the Akademischen Trushkin. And kind of the key findings from the NABOS cruise are that the stratification in the Arctic is becoming less stable in the Eurasian sector. And that's really important because that's allowing the Atlantic water heat to reach into the surface, and that has implications for sea ice melt. Another associated with that is there's been a strengthening of this vertical gradient stratification in the Canadian side of the basin. I guess the other interesting result that Igor shared is that the summer currents right now, this summer, are 3 to 4 times stronger than they have been in the past. So again, need to understand that better. Next slide, please. So the next slide is work led by Judith Rosalind Drucker. She's a postdoc at the CIFAR School of Fisheries at the University of Alaska, sits in Juneau, and she's been developing this integrated ecosystem assessment program and contributing to that. And the field work that she's been doing is working in co-production of information with local communities in southeastern Alaska and using information there to build up this ecosystem model and to validate it. And I guess the key highlights, it highlights the importance of including local knowledge in developing these models. And that feeds into the bigger idea of NOAA's contribution to Alaska's fishery management structure. Next slide, please. We've heard from Jessica. This is work by Natalie Manaki, who's at UAF, and work done with Jessica on ocean acidification program. I guess I'll just highlight a couple things that weren't mentioned earlier. This is a fairly multi-agency funded piece of observations. And I guess the highlight is that the data collected in the coastal waters of Alaska are showing extreme, rapid, and extensive progression of acidification. So the acidification is stronger than in other parts of the U.S. waters. So therefore, it's really important to continue these observations, and the economic impacts that it has in Alaska are that it would affect the Alaska king crab fisheries in the Bering Sea. Next slide, please. So the last work is contributed by Russ Hopcroft, who is a CIFAR PI. And this is a synthesis of lots of observations. And this is the Arctic Marine Biodiversity Report. And it's put together by CAF. And if you go to the next slide, please. I'll just highlight, the introduction has a lot of highlights from all this fairly large report. And I'll just mention a few things. What they find is from synthesizing all these observations, there's a northward movement is easier for mobile open water species. There's an increased number and diversity of southern species moving into Arctic waters, so that has bearing for fisheries management. Again, sea ice reliant species are affected much more than species that can adapt. That's consistent with a lot of work that's been funded by NOAA through the DBO. And finally, kind of something that was, I guess I hadn't been aware of, was that Arctic marine species and ecosystems are undergoing pressure from cumulative changes to their physical, chemical, and biological environment. So again, thank you.
Thank you, Uma. Okay, so I am going to quickly open up Dawn's slides. So in the next couple of minutes while I'm opening up Dawn's slides, are there any questions that folks have on the line about any of the presentations that were given? Okay, so hearing none, I am going to turn the floor over to Dawn. Dawn, are you still with us?
I'm still here.
I'm so sorry that I didn't get your slides into the deck. Best
That's
for
fine.
last. All right, your slides are up. Ready?
Yep. Yeah, I'd like to talk about some of the work we're doing with sea ice mass balance buoys, and in particular look at three of the elements we've been focused on this past year. The first is updating our webpage. You can see the address at the bottom, and some of it was just improving the look and feel, but the main thing was that we have results from 110 mass balance buoys going back 20 years. And now all that data is available. It's all gone through a quality control process. And you can see it on this web page now. I'm also going to talk about our new buoy design and give an idea of what these instruments do by looking at results from 2 deployments. Next slide, please. You know, we've been looking at the sea ice mass balance for quite a while, where the mass balance is simply how much the ice grows in the winter and how much it melts in the summer, both on the surface and the bottom. And then also what's the temperature profile from the atmosphere right above the ice, through the snow, through the ice, and into the upper ocean. And when we started doing this, we had a design that was great for multi-year ice. Wasn't so good for first-year ice because when the ice melted, the instruments would all fall out. And so what we've been working on and finally have completed a next generation ice mass balance buoy, the sea ice mass balance buoy version 3. And what you see here is a sketch of it in the middle. To give an idea of the scale, it's around 5 meters long. It's piped, it's 10 centimeters in diameter. It's basically a spar buoy that's put in the ice, but it also floats, and even better, it floats upright in open water. It has a number of sensors, including 2 acoustic sensors. You can see one on the top looking down, keeping track of where the surface is, one on the bottom looking up, keeping track of where the bottom is. And from this information, we can determine how the ice grows and how it melts. And to give you an idea of how this works, let's look at the next slide. And I'm going to take a quick look at results from two of our buoys. You can see here one that was deployed this spring and drifted for a couple months, and then one that was deployed in September of 2017 and melted out in July of 2017. And I should mention that these are all our next generation buoys, and they transmit back via iridium. Next slide, please. This particular buoy was deployed from aircraft in conjunction with some other instruments that were measuring the amount of sunlight above the ice and through the ice cover. You can see the drift started north of Alaska at the end of March, and it drifted along the northern coast of Alaska until May, when it stopped transmitting. And what we can see, this was put in first year ice. The total amount of growth we had that year was around 120 centimeters, which is a little bit on the light side for this part of the world. And we also only had around 10 centimeters of snow. Next slide, please. The results from this buoy are a lot more interesting. It was deployed in September of 2017, and you can see its drift track in red all the way through the 22nd of July, and that should be 2018, not 2017. And what's shown underneath the drift track is a map of ice concentration on that day, where the star denotes where the buoy was. And you can see it was in water of ice concentration that was around 50%. And what you see plotted on the right is a sample of the results we get from this buoy. It's a time series from October 17 to July of 18. There's air temperature measurements, and on the bottom there's water temperature measurements. You might see that in July the water temperature started to increase. There was warming of the water. The really interesting part is in the middle, where we see the temperatures in the ice that are color-coded. The black line denotes the bottom of the ice, or on the right-hand side, the top of the ice. And you can see that we started out with ice that was second-year ice. It just made it through the summer, was half a meter thick. And it grew a little over a meter during the course of the winter. And then towards the end of May, the melt season started, and we had, we were able to measure around 60 centimeters of bottom melt and around 60 centimeters of surface melt, at which point the buoy melted out. And we have information like this. As I said, we have a historical record going back 20 years from over 100 different buoys. Just 2 days ago, we deployed a buoy basically to replace this one and around the same location in the Beaufort Sea, and we're looking forward to keeping track of it. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Don. So with that, any quick questions that folks have about any of the presentations?
Emily, would you mind putting the agenda back up?
I'm desperately trying to find it.
Oh, shoot.
Sorry.
No problem.
My screens just get so crazy on Zoom.
So I'll just start by jumping in to say, to share my thanks for everybody's presentations as well. When Emily, Jim Overland, and I conceived of what we wanted to do in this discussion, you all really showed up and helped us understand the first part of what we hope to accomplish, which was the breadth of all the observing activities across OAR Arctic work that happened in 2018 in particular. And what we're going to shift gears into now is a sense of how we might best look at opportunities to sort of synthesize and boil down some aspects of this work in some persistent ways. How can we capture the value of what you've all shared and develop things that'll be easily discoverable, accessible, and available to each other, and hopefully some of our NOAA leadership as well. And so to help us with that, we've invited Bill Manley and Allison Gaylord of the Arctic Observing viewer team. And they're going to give a presentation on a tool that they've been actively maintaining for many years that already contains a lot of information on NOAA observations. And we're hoping that through this phone call, they've been exposed to more people who they could reach out to, or that you yourselves as principal investigators will see the value in what they're creating, and maybe reach out back to them, or commit to reach back to them and share more information. So with that, I will turn it over to Bill.
All right, great. Thanks, Sandy. Let's see here.
Let me stop sharing. Okay, Bill, you should be ready to go. Able to share.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Sandy and Emily. It was, just saying, there we go. All right, so it was fascinating to hear more about, what all is going on with NOAA, and wow, a lot going on. And so today we wanted to give a brief overview about the Arctic Observing Viewer. This is a map-based web application. And also on the line is Allison Gaylord, our technical specialist. We work closely with Craig Tweedy at the University of Texas and his graduate students. And this is all funded by the National Science Foundation. And it's Craig's graduate students that actually do the GIS and the software development and the database management, et cetera. And then in cooperation with the Arctic logistics provider for NSF. So there's a challenge of knowing who is doing what where with Arctic Observing. And where are the gaps, the overlap, what assets already exist, how can we better achieve scientific objectives? With all those presentations that we saw, a great number of amazing, wonderful maps that contain a great deal of information. And so, essentially, would it be helpful to have one web-based map that shows all the related observing sites in one place? And so AOV was created for this in mind, and NSF wants it to be broadly comprehensive, not just NSF, and it's growing. And hopefully that comprehensiveness then allows researchers to find and for discovery and access to related observing activities. So the scope is circumarctic, and like I said, it's mainly NSF, but actually there's a lot more than that right now already. Repeat observing activities across the terrestrial, atmospheric, and oceanic systems, and broadly defined as Arctic observing, which generally means anywhere there's a repeat measurement. So to help address the questions earlier, we share a collective vision or conceptual model that spans a project data lifecycle from project planning on the left with RMAP, our sister application for project level information, through network and observation planning, if you will, to on the right data set usage and understanding, data access and reuse. And that there's this spectrum to meet multiple user needs and a hierarchical approach. So on the left, you can envision one project location. So that we define as a logistical base of operation, a village or an airstrip or a base camp. And that project can have multiple data collection sites or observing sites. And then those sites can each have multiple data sets, which themselves reside, appropriately so, in data repositories, data archives, data centers. And so this vision includes the idea that you can move left and right across the spectrum for observation and data access and discovery and reuse to address questions and user needs such as these. So this is a screenshot of AOV. It currently has almost 15,000 observing sites. 15,000 over 2,700 networks and coordinated activities, what we call initiatives. And so you can click on a point and get a pop-up, and it'll provide this some details, including if you scroll down, it'll give links to more information and to data. If we have that on the left, you can search and filter by number of parameters, and then those search results are shown in the table down below and highlighted on the map. And then there's some other map layers that might be helpful or relevant. So there's almost 30 initiatives already in AOV, and highlighted here are the ones that are NOAA or related to NOAA. And our team of grad student and postdoc have done what they can to harvest manually, mostly from different initiative websites and resources, rather than bugging individual PIs. And so there's a lot in there already, and including various other perhaps related initiatives. So you can take advantage of the viewer and gain a comprehensive perspective by adding your sites if they're not already in there, and we'd be happy to work with you on that. And there's a few different ways we can do that, either sharing shape files or GIS data, or more technical means of having interoperable web services that are live feeds using ISO metadata, or actually what works really well often is a template spreadsheet. And so we can help with that. We have a template spreadsheet on the website, and it's pretty easy. So these are the site level metadata fields, the site details in AOV for each site, observing site. And some of the more important ones are highlighted a little bit there. And this may look daunting, but it's actually simple, high order discovery level stuff meant to be, lightweight, if you will, for easy linking to more information where it's appropriately housed. So in AOV, we already have the ISO Observatories, for example, as sites in its own layer also. Currently, we have, as funded by NOAA, 985 collection sites that you see there as the little yellow squares. And they cover a variety of NOAA activities. For example, these are the different initiatives that are under NOAA in AOVs thus far, and no doubt there's more that could be added to make it comprehensively useful for many people with planning and access and integration and synthesis. So next steps. This is really up to you or to us, or see if we're happy to collaborate and identify and help with which NOAA initiatives to include in AOV. We can be in touch with points of contact and help with getting with information sharing. And it may be helpful to review existing NOAA records and then just edit them as needed, or add to them as needed. And there's other ways that we can share information. So this is Allison's email address on top. She may want to kick in here, and then my email address, and I'm curious to hear if you all think that such a tool would be of interest. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that, Bill. And if you go back to your previous slide, I think this is really the heart of what we, Jim, Emily, myself, thought would be useful to discuss. Even in the course of reviewing the run-up to this discussion, Allison and Bill looked at the slide deck from our last meeting, and they quickly identified, for example, that the climate reference network sites were not in in the viewer, and that is exactly the kind of site that would, in all likelihood, benefit from being in the viewer, and vice versa. And so I think the opportunity here is, if you see your work already listed as one of the initiatives, to get back on the viewer, make sure things look like they're up to date and accurate, and that there might be more details to add of recent work. If you don't see your work in the viewer and you see the value of being able to share your information into these common maps and common parameters, let's hear from you and figure out a way to get a point of contact from your project in touch with the AOV team. I can convey that sitting where I sit with the Arctic Observing Network, and I know similarly with Emily in her programmatic position, having these kinds of visual aids to support our discussion with leadership is often really extremely valuable. Just having something like a NOAA map layer of observing activities can really tell a very succinct story about where we're working and what the activities are. So that's really the essence, I think, of what we were hoping to get out of the discussion. I might just take people off mute because I can't remember who I muted, and I want to make sure people can speak if they are interested. And so I'm going to unmute everybody, and if it gets noisy, then we'll selectively remute. Oh, and I should add, if you muted yourself, then me unmuting it doesn't do anything.
Sandy, do you want to move on to the last section of the meeting?
I could. I'm curious if there's any dialogue to be had on this point.
Mm-hmm.
I know people are being kind of quiet, and maybe that's just because you're absorbing and taking it in, but.
This is Lee Cooper. I just wondered, some of we have requirements to participate in this Alaska Ocean Observing System portal, and I wondered if there was any kind of meshing of those, or potential meshing of those two systems, because it superficially looks very similar. It's not on land primarily. It's primarily in the ocean, but just wondered what the reaction to that comment would be.
We collaborate with them as partners with somewhat different scope. And Allison might want to chime in as well.
Yes, actually, we had a meeting with Sandy and Rob Bachanuk from Axiom on Monday to talk about this in particular. And yeah, we've been doing more of a look back of where people have been sampling, and they had been more focused on where activities were planned to occur. And they had started just with the Chukchi Sea and then expanded to waters around Alaska. And they're uncertain about whether they're going to continue, I guess, that effort or not, is what we were last heard. So I was curious about the requirement to report to the research assets application.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we've got a couple of projects where we set up these kind of collaboration teams and share data, post it, and our Ambon project, for example, which is Arctic Marine Biodiversity Observing Network, that's supported in part by NOAA, that they've made that part of our responsibility for sharing data.
Gotcha. Yeah, we both also have open web services so that we can exchange information on the back end. We are collecting similar attributes for each of the dots that you see here in Transects, but there are some differences for sure.
So yeah, The research assets tool by EOS is more of a forecasting and logistics planning tool, and then this is more of a tracking and archiving and synthesis tool, and then looking back. And then they're different in geographic and thematic scope a little bit too. Oh, one other thing I want to mention is that, you know, AOV is not a data portal. We link to the various data portals. Instead, it's more of a new intermediate level that should be helpful for observation, network planning, and discovery and access. So yeah.
Yeah, so this is Jackie Grebmeier. So and under that comment, then would this portal be then linked like a web to the, like the NSF has requirement and like DBO data goes, some of the funding from that goes into the Arctic Data Center, but some of the information we have, our NOAA funding goes into the AOS portal, like Lee was saying with Ambon, that has embedded in it. So I'm wondering, are you going to be able to link to all the different agencies where they have the observing requirements for archiving and just provide a spatial map like I'm seeing on the screen now, or and then behind it point people to where the actual raw data is sitting?
We've been making efforts to connect to archive pages at the NSF Arctic Data Center. If there are other data centers that are used, we'll reference those as well. We have not tapped into like the AOS research workspace. I'm not sure if they actually have public data archive pages available. I know they're working with Data One, so some of that information may actually end up in the NSF archive.
Right, and then on the other one, because a lot of the physical oceanography all needs to go to NODC and the requirements. So that's what you know, we have we're funded federally by multiple agencies that have requirements of data going to different places. And if this was able to point, at the minimum, to point to where those data sets are in a coordinated fashion for the observing program, I think that would be very valuable.
Yes, we try to do our best to do that, to discover which archives have the information, but we haven't been reaching out directly to PIs. Okay. It would be super helpful to even just have a couple PIs look over, like for instance, what we have for the DBO, and if we're pointing at the right data archives. I believe we're just pointing at your webpage right now, for DBO in particular.
Okay.
So like for the International Arctic Buoy program, we point at that archive, for instance.
Thank you.
Any other comments before we switch to our last agenda item? Bruce?
Yeah, I had one comment. I know my program manager, Howard Diamond, had mentioned something about getting the CRN and the, is it the Arctic Observing? Did someone contact him about the this particular Arctic Observing viewer to get our data in there?
Yeah, we just connected that, made that connection a couple of days ago.
Okay, great. He mentioned something to me. He's down visiting me, so I'll circle back around and let him know a little bit more about it.
Very good. Thank you, Bruce.
And we'll share this slide deck as well.
That'd be great if you did. That'd be super.
And actually, I had a question if the rest of the slide deck could be shared. There's a lot of information in here, which I'd love to follow up on.
Absolutely. I will do that and circulate either later today or tomorrow.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's rather hard to digest this all in an hour and a half.
We did also record the meeting, and so we're planning, like with the last meeting that we had, that we will post this, and I can share a link, and so you can go back and watch and pause and rewatch parts if you need to.
Great, and thanks again to the AOV team. I think that if Bruce is an indication, people are absorbing what they saw. I think it would be valuable when the recording and the slides go out. Maybe Emily and I'll just put a few bullets in there. If you didn't see your initiative listed and you feel like there would be value to you in getting it listed, we'll follow up with actions. If you are listed, go in and assess if the information's accurate along the lines of what Jackie discussed. thank you in advance for any actions you take here, because it will make our jobs a lot easier.
Okay, so for our last agenda item, we just wanted to open it up in case anyone has any comments unrelated to any of the presentations. We are going to get a quick update from Sandy on the upcoming Arctic Science Ministerial, which is going to be in October in Berlin. So Sandy, if you want to jump in, and then we'll open it up if anyone has any quick questions, and then I can do a close.
Okay, yeah, this should be pretty brief. I'll drop the website into the chat for the Science Ministerial. 2 years ago, the U.S. hosted the first Arctic Science Ministerial at the White House under the Obama administration, hosted by John Holdren, and the invited group included, to everyone, here's the link. The invited group included people at that level, the John Holdrens of nations that are interested or have a stake in Arctic observing. 25 different countries joined. There was a big call for deliverables about what kind of international collaborative science activities could be supported and propelled through the ministerial. Some of the examples, like the Year of Polar Prediction that we've talked about a bit today, were some examples of those initiatives, as was, I believe, to a degree, the Pacific Arctic Group, which supports work like what's done with the DBO and such. The success of the ministerial and the enthusiasm of the ministerial was followed up by the EU, who decided that it would be valuable to do a follow-up 2 years later. And so this one is being co-hosted by the EU, Germany, and Finland, who's currently the chair of the Arctic Council. Our science delegation from the US side is going to be led by France Cordova from the National Science Foundation, and also joining are Tim Gallaudet, our acting head of NOAA, and Fran Ulmer of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. They are the ministerial delegates for a one-day meeting with themes on observing, resilience, and global linkages. The day prior, there's going to be a science forum to which each country was allowed to nominate a science delegation of up to 10 people. Jackie Grebmeier, you're part of the science delegation. Myself, I'm part of the science delegation. Some familiar names, I don't think anyone else on the phone is, but some other familiar names include Hayo Aiken, Walid Abdullati, Peter Pulsifer. I don't have everybody's name at the top of my head. Julie Brigham Getty of the Polar Research Board. And so there'll be a science forum the day before where we, from the standpoint of the community level, talk about the observing, resilience, and global linkages issues to better inform the ministers. And they already have a lot of deliverables that have been identified by each country. Things are going to be pretty packaged and pretty scripted at the point where the ministerial actually occurs. But I think Jim Overland in particular thought it would be a good idea for us to just give everybody on this call an update about the scope of the ministerial and what the expectations are. If it's like the last ministerial, we anticipate a joint statement and certainly an uptick in attention on Arctic issues within the US. And with Gallaudet as part of the delegation, we anticipate that there might be some higher visibility around Arctic, at least during that time period. So I'm happy to answer any questions. Some people are ready for lunch, I think.
Hey, Sandy, this is John Woods from the Ice Center.
Hi, John.
I'm just curious for briefing materials for that. I feel like I've heard about high-level actions collecting those, but I haven't seen them down at the worker bee level, those requests. Am I missing something along the line?
It could be that the requests have already come and gone. The deliverables were due, I want to say in June, May or June. And so you may, without not knowing it, have provided language that ended up in those deliverables. I think the deliverables will be released after the ministerial. They're all still close hold while they're being synthesized right now.
Okay, that sounds fair. Like I said, I'm just at the working level. I'm not sure the word's getting all the way down to there to say, hey, you know, what's going on? What are you guys doing to support this? But as long as it sounds like everyone's covered, then I'm happy. Yeah,
fair enough. Thank you, John. And my request to you earlier today is not completely unrelated to that.
Copy.
Okay, back to you, Emily.
All right. Well, I just wanted to quickly wrap up and thank everyone who called in today and all of our speakers who gave us updates, and also the AOB team. Thank you so much. I hope we've made some connections, and I hope that everyone found this useful to get an update on what's going on in the world, and look out for probably some meeting notes as well as a recording and the presentations, all of the presentations from today in your inbox in the very near future. So again, just a reminder, our next Arctic OAR All Hands will be focused on modeling, which will be probably early on in 2019, so keep an eye out for that. And thank you all so much, and have a fantastic day.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.